Year 12. So this is our first video looking back at the Paris Anthology. And before I dive right into annotation, just do a bit of quick recapping on the assessment objectives for Paris and how that differs from the Duffy, because it has been a couple of months now, I think probably February, since we were looking at the Paris Anthology. So a little bit of a recap on that for you. And today in this video, I'm going to do some annotation on Paris. Now, the first thing to say is that quite obviously these texts are much longer than the poems. So while in a series of 2 videos I can cover pretty much everything you would need to know for one of the Duffy poems, there's no way of doing enough annotation on Paris just on the video, otherwise the videos would be an hour and a half or 2 hours long. So every time I do a Paris video, you will need to imagine adding on maybe 45 minutes or so at some point afterwards, just to go around and find a couple of other examples. So what I will strive to do in these videos is make sure you're really clear on the type of writing for that genre, so you know the type of thing you're looking for, but you will have to find a couple more examples. And some are obviously longer than others. The one we're about to do today isn't that long, I think it's 5 pages. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's closer to 7 actually. But I will do a bit of annotation under each subheading, and then you can just go, like I say, and find a few extra examples. And I think that's the best way to go through this. So first thing I'm going to do is just remind you of the assessment objectives for the Paris Anthology, and I'm just going to find a random page to do that with. So you will remember, here I've gone to page 91 and I've got part of the Paris for Children text. So you remember that we annotated in 3 colours for Paris. Our yellow annotation is A04. I'm just going to make these notes up here. There we go. So assessment objective 4 was in yellow, and what I've got here is restricted for families. That was representation of Paris. Remember, with each text we're looking at how does Paris come across, and that is your assessment objective 4, that's your representation. You don't need to write this down, you probably remember. I'm just being a bit cautious on my recapping. So how does Paris come across? It's also the assessment objective for the comparison, but we don't need to worry about that when we're just annotating one text. Our kind of peachy coloured annotation is the same as I've done on the poetry, so that's your A01. And to be honest, I think that was a bit of a fluke that I ended up doing in the same colour, so that has worked out well. That is your language levels. And your A03, which is the one missing, is purple. Now, assessment objective 3 doesn't appear on the poetry. This is your context. So remember how important this is for Paris. Remember, your context is all of the things that you identify at the start of a text. So just pulling this page over a little bit, hopefully you can see. Remember that the context is your genre, your audience, your purpose, your text producer, your text receiver, your mode, and your register. So that's a little recap. Oh look, I had a neat little list there that I could have shown you. That is a little recap of what the assessment objectives are. How does Paris come across? What are the language levels? And what are the reasons for this language use? What are the contextual factors? So now that we've recapped that, I'm going to read the contextualisation for the on Paris text that we're doing today. And then I'm going to go straight in with some annotation for you. Now, let me get the contextualisation. Okay, here we go on page 8. So Ernest Hemingway, 1899 to 1961, was an American author and journalist who moved to Paris in the 1920s. Whilst he worked here as a foreign correspondent for the Toronto Star Weekly, this text contains a selection of pieces he wrote for the paper on aspects of life in Paris. Now, I said on Tuesday when we were in school that we had one text left, which was within the kind of journalistic genre. And it's a bit of a loose genre within the anthology. I thought I'd just point out another text that you've done that's within that journalistic genre, just to remind you. So if you turn to 127, that's your Paris riots text. Now that's one of the last ones we did before, when we were in school, before we moved on to the poetry. And remember, that was the one that was the, remember, it had like the video to go along with it and the kind of dramatic music. And this was a newsreel done for British, and then I never work out how to say that, Pathé or Paith. So remember, in terms of journalism, we said that the purpose is usually informative, but there's also a kind of entertaining purpose as well. The type of journalism you read in here is not the journalism that is just factual reporting, so it doesn't have to be unbiased. And then the text receivers, text producers are going to change depending on who the text is. But this was just a little reminder of some of the other things that fall within the journalistic genre, but it is quite a small one. So we've done Paris Riots, and now we're looking at On Paris by Hemingway. And this is a good text to bridge the two genres that we're doing. So we're finishing journalism with this one today. And then next we're moving on to the memoir genre, like I said on Tuesday. So this has got, I mean, it is journalism because he's writing it for a newspaper, and he is a foreign correspondent for that newspaper, somebody who lives abroad but writes back to the home audience about what's happening. He is a foreign correspondent, he is a journalist, but he writes it in such a personal way that it almost feels a little bit like a memoir. So that's why this is quite a nice text to do to bridge those two genres. So without further ado, let's do what we usually do, which is to identify all the aspects of the context, which you should be able to do just from reading that contextualization. So the genre is that they are extracts from newspaper articles. Obviously, it being extracts is important because we're going to be getting highlights, like particularly good bits, particularly funny bits perhaps. Mode, it's written. And there's no sense of it being blended, it's just been written for a newspaper, it was written in the 20s, there's nothing blended there. Now, his audience. He was writing this for the Toronto Star Weekly, so he has a Canadian audience. And that will be relevant when we start to look at what the text is about. The text producer is Hemingway. Now, some of you might know a little bit about Ernest Hemingway, obviously a very famous writer, kind of during and after his journalistic career, but something to note about him is that he is an American and fiction writer. The register we will kind of see as we go through, but it's a kind of medium to high register. There's some comedy which brings it slightly lower, so it's not high throughout. And his purpose, similar to the purpose of the Paris Riots text, which was also journalistic, is to inform, to entertain, and to describe his time in Paris, because as a foreign correspondent he lives elsewhere, and part of the kind of point of having a foreign correspondent for a newspaper is that it gives people an insight into another way of life, like something interesting to read about what it would be like to live in Paris, for example. So he's kind of partially describing what his life is like there. So we've done, this is all AO3, we've recapped our AO3, and I'm going to find a couple of examples per subheading now for you that kind of illustrates his points about what Paris is like and gives you an idea of his style, and then you'll go in and you'll find some more. So he splits, if we just look at the, in fact, first thing to do, pause the video now. If you haven't read this text, pause it now and read through the whole thing, read through the 5 or 6 pages, so that when I'm talking you've got a sense of what's happening. So if you haven't done that, do that now. Okay, so you've read the text now, and you'll see that he's split it up into 3 little sections: Wild Night Music, The Mecca of Fakers, and American Bohemians. So he's kind of got 3 thematically separated topics. So we know that this section is about American Bohemians. And Bohemians were, I'm going to put this down as an AO3 point, some kind of historical context here. So that was a kind of emerging social group at the time. Remember, the time is the 1920s. So Bohemians, in other words, kind of quite a hippie-ish lifestyle, often very involved in the arts. But this was a new type of social group, so he's writing about something that's quite cutting edge. I mean, we can make a very basic point here. Level 6, we've got a bold title, which is important. For something like a newspaper, you need to be able to see exactly what you're going to be reading. And you'll notice that he begins each of his sections with the word Paris. Now that's to indicate that that's where this is coming from, so it's something that correspondents would do. So in terms of level 6 structure, that is really important for clarity, isn't it? It's just reminding the reader, oh yeah, this is the bit from the foreign correspondent. What I'm about to read is coming directly from Paris. Okay. So that's some of the stuff that doesn't actually tell us a huge amount about how Paris is presented. It's more just in terms of the genre and what we would expect structurally from that genre. But then we get into some of the more kind of classically Hemingway style writing, quite funny, lots and lots of metaphor to describe. And particularly in this opening paragraph, we get the repetition of versions of the word scum to build up this metaphor. So he says, new scum, oldest scum, thickest scum, scummiest scum. And there we go. So he is describing the people who have come to Paris from this part of New York, and he's describing them as scum. So this is an extended metaphor. And he has extended the metaphor through varied use of different adjectives, so different superlative adjectives, scummiest, oldest, thickest, and then just a opinionative adjective. So extended metaphor, but I'll also add superlative adjectives. That's how he's developed it. Superlatives. And what he is saying there, so scum obviously is something that kind of rises to the top, kind of impurities in the water, kind of grease and things. Pretty unpleasant image, isn't it? So he's saying that these people, these Americans, now bearing in mind he himself is American, but he's writing for Canadians, and you might know that there's kind of a age-old rivalry, a little bit like between Scotland and England, I suppose. Countries that border one another that have had kind of tension in the past often have that ongoing rivalry. There's a bit of a kind of rivalry between Canadians and Americans, and he's describing these Americans as scum. So he's clearly trying to be funny. He's trying to be, oh sorry, year 12. Sounds like that's boring me, and it's really not. He's trying to be funny. So we're trying to bring in some of his purpose here. So he's trying to entertain and to inform. He's trying to be humorous. And he is appealing to that rivalry. And we can put that in because that is all about his text receivers, his audience. So he's appealing to the rivalry between Canada and the US. So aspects of his context there to do with purpose, to do with text receiver. And you could also, I think, because of how he builds that metaphor, and it becomes kind of, I mean, scummiest scum is trying to be absurd, isn't he? He's building up the levels of humour. You could say this is also hyperbole. You could add that in as another AO1 technique. And how does that present Paris? Remember, that's our third assessment objective, AO4. And actually, I've gone the opposite way, haven't I? I would usually suggest by starting with the AO4, but I got carried away by talking about the scum. Well, he's presenting Paris as somewhere that has been kind of infected by these Americans. So in the 1920s, to give you a bit of background, lots of these new bohemians, these new kind of hippies interested in the arts, moved to Paris because Paris was a big art scene. I'm sure if you do art, you will know about this, and perhaps just if you don't from general knowledge, it's a huge art scene. So lots of people moved there to kind of experience the lifestyle, to be inspired, to create great art. But actually, Hemingway's saying these people were just scum, and they have kind of infected this beautiful Parisian lifestyle. They've come over here with their crude ways, and they have infected it. So he's actually saying Paris has been infected by these Americans. But also, if you think about scum, we said it rises to the top and it kind of separates from the rest of the material. So I suppose he's saying in a way that they were quite obvious, they stood out. Paris managed, although it began by being infected by the scum, it's managed to push it to the top. So it could also, Paris could also be presented as kind of rejecting these Americans by turning them into scum and pushing them to the top rather than letting them mix too much. And that tone, that cynical, quite critical tone that Hemingway has here about these Americans in Paris is really typical of the way he writes the rest of the text. So you might find other examples of him being quite critical of Americans. Okay, now there is another extended metaphor which runs through a lot of the text. So I'm going to pick out the examples and we're going to do it down here. And I'm going to try, because I'm conscious, as you should be when you're annotating, trying to find a range of language levels. And so far we've got 6 and extended metaphors 5. So I don't want to just pick out another extended metaphor, but it is an important one. It's superlatives level 1. So I'll pick out the metaphor, but I'll try and find some other techniques in it as well. And it begins in here. He says it is a strange acting and strange looking breed that crowd the tables of the Café Rotonde. And hopefully when you were reading it, you will have identified this. He describes the people as animals. These Americans as animals. So I'm just going to put that. In fact, I'm going to annotate it slightly further down with some more examples. So he says that the cafe that all these Americans sit in is like a birdhouse, which is part of that extended metaphor. And he said that even the waiters begin to act like that, like so many black and white magpies. And they fly around and they squawk. Now this is the Americans that squawk. And there we go. I think that's enough examples. There are some on the next page, but we'll find them later. So there we go. We have another extended metaphor. Of these Americans being animalistic. So that takes me straight into level 4. How is Paris presented? Paris is presented as, oh gosh, I want to go in and write menagerie, and I'm not 100% sure of its spelling, so I'm going to do a very quick check so I don't spell something wrong. That would be bad on a video that's going to last forever and ever. There. So Paris is a menagerie of animalistic Americans. And also the waiters as well. And he's clearly trying to point out something about their lack of manners, their lack of breeding. He says that they squawk and that they are a breed. He describes them as raucous as well, so we could pick out that within the extended metaphor. We can pick out this adjective here. We can pick out this verb, squawking. So all these words building up that sense that they behave badly, they're uncouth, they're not sophisticated, they don't fit in with Paris. And it makes it seem quite kind of chaotic, doesn't it? So it's a menagerie of animalistic Americans. I'm just going to add in /chaotic. Now my AO3, remember when we were doing this that partially your AO3 is a process of going through everything you've identified here and trying to find how we could link it. Well, I think this idea of building up this extended metaphor we can link quite nicely to mode, because remember, in the spoken mode, very few people are eloquent or present enough when they're speaking to speak an extended metaphor. Most people speak much more literally than that. So we can say that this is an element of the mode, and the fact that it's written allows Hemingway to build up these extended metaphors. So he builds them for his audience, and that is part of the written mode. Also, figurative techniques tend to be, not solely, but usually in the written mode. Here we go. Okay, I'm going to find one more thing on this page and then I'm going to move on. And it is another metaphor, but we're likely to see more figurative techniques, so I'm not too worried about finding another one of those. He describes the Rotonde is the name of the cafe. He describes the Americans in there as inmates. So we've got a short metaphor there, but it shows how Hemingway builds up his criticism, because he's speaking now, describing them as inmates describes Paris as a prison, which is really building up this picture of it being something that can entrap people. So his metaphor describes Paris as a prison, and more importantly the Americans as somehow kind of mentally unstable. So US mentally unstable. Let me go for representation. And what am I going to link that to in terms of my AO3? I think I'm going to link this to the fact that he is, let's think about, we've not done text producer yet. He is American himself, and I'm going to say that this makes him seem like quite an outsider, but perhaps that links into the fact that he lives in Paris, he doesn't live in the US anymore, and he has a bit of an outsider status with his own people. So text producer, Hemingway seems like a bit of an outsider, because he is able to critique his fellow Americans quite so harshly, which suggests he doesn't feel that much affinity with them anymore, partly because of where he does his job. Okay, so we've got a good 3 examples there from this American Bohemian section. I'll do a bit more in the first section than I will in the second 2, and then you've got one section that you can be pretty confident that you can use as examples. Now, in this section, he picks up on something else. So he's still been critical of the Americans there, but rather than being critical of their behaviour, he is also really critical of how they look. Because if you think about Paris's reputation as being somewhere that is really sophisticated and glamorous and elegant, he picks on these poor women, sitting at a table in the Café Rotonde, and he really goes to town on her appearance. So, just thinking how to get my page so you can see it. Here we go, let me just check you can see that from the screen. Yes, you can. So, again, it's the base of a figurative technique. He picks out face like a pink enamelled ham. And it's kind of an extended piece of description of her. He describes her as having as being like a red mince pie, and also he repeats the adjective big when he's describing her. Big light-haired woman, big woman, and big woman again, slightly further down. There we go. So this extended description of her, which uses simile up here, face like a pink enamelled ham, And then you've got another simile here, like a red mince pie. And then you've got repetition of the adjective big. So what he's trying to do is make fun of her appearance. She's clearly not elegant and petite like this stereotype of a French woman. She doesn't kind of fit into the surroundings, is what he's trying to say. So he is, what is the representation? If you got this text, I think it would be worded like something like representation of people in Paris. So how are people represented in Paris here? Well, the Americans are represented as really standing out, aren't they? Not fitting in, not being elegant enough. So the Americans stand out. They are inelegant, and they are unsophisticated. And you can kind of get a sense of that unsophisticated nature through what he chooses to describe her as, a pink enamelled ham. Doesn't sound very sophisticated, does it, in terms of the type of food? It doesn't sound very Parisian, it sounds quite bog standard, maybe quite American. And what he's doing here, so this is kind of one main point. I've just found lots of examples to make it. Like a red mince pie, again, he's making her sound that she stands out, quite ungainly and quite homely. Again, not glamorous. Mince pies, we don't think of them as being particularly glamorous types of food. It sounds like she doesn't belong in that glamorous setting. She belongs in more of a homely setting. So people are presented as ungainly, as homely. And here, I think he's really just saying, because of that stereotype of the Parisians being like chic and thin and watching what they eat, and the kind of opposite representation of Americans often as being quite large, not being conscious of what they eat, he is, I think we can just say he's representing the Americans as greedy. And now what's going to pull this all together is our AO3. So why is he doing this? I think this links most to text receiver. I think he is, because Canadians have this rivalry with Americans, and Canada structurally as a country is much more like Britain. It's much more European. It has a huge French population, or French Canadian population. It's got much more kind of socialist policies. It's much more like Europe than it is like Britain. I think he's trying to get them on side, and he's trying to present their American neighbours as being really kind of embarrassing in a way that's going to make the Canadians feel quite superior. So I think I'm going to link that to text receiver. And he is trying to entertain them, but he's trying to make them feel superior through his through the way he entertains them. I hope that makes sense to you, because it's quite kind of backbone of this whole text. Okay. So I'm going to end this section with one more annotation, and then I'm going to do a little bit on Wild Night Music, a little bit on the Mecca of Fakers as well. If you go right over to the end of this section here, what you will see he's building up is the idea that Paris, for these Americans, they didn't really come over to properly put in the time and work at being artists. They came over to sit and pose in cafes. And he kind of summarises that right at the end of this section by juxtaposing two verbs. And I think this is a nice bit of small, but a nice bit of patterning you could look at. So he says, but the gang that congregates at the corner of the Boulevard Raspail have no time to work at anything else. They put in a full day at the Rotonde. So again, he's talking about these Americans that just sit all day at the cafe, pose, pretend to be painting, pretend to be bohemians, but actually they're just a bit fake. So the two verbs, so juxtaposing the verb work and the phrasal verb put in. So phrasal verb. There we go, verb and phrasal verb. He's saying that actually the work that they should be doing is the creation of their art. They're too busy to do that because they are putting in, usually a verb you would use to describe, like, I'm putting in the hours. He's playing on it and laughing at it. He's saying ironically that they're so busy sitting at the cafe all day they don't have time to do their work. So juxtaposing those two verbs shows and represents these Americans. It's quite lazy and vain. You just want to sit around the cafe rotonde and be seen to be artists rather than actually creating art. And I'm going to link that to the text producer this time, and I'm going to say he's really critical. It's a very critical voice, and that's part of his writing. It's part of, wrong colour, part of his appeal, part of what makes him different. Okay, so you might want to go in and find, I'd say, one other example in that section. Now for Wild Night Music and for Mecca of Fakers, I'm going to give you one or maybe two examples, and you will need to fill in some more. So you should have read Wild Night Music. You might want to pause and just reread that again, just to get it fresh in your mind. Okay, so you should have reread it, and I'm going to start with another extended metaphor that you see in this section here, which describes Paris as being fake, something that is constructed for the tourist rather than being a real place. And it is this kind of extended description here. So Paris, the heart of the metaphor is here. Paris is operated at great profit for the entertainment of the buyer. So Paris is operated, the metaphor is that Paris is a machine. You can operate a machine, can't you? Something like a slot machine. You put money into it and it comes to life for the entertainment of the buyer. So the metaphor is that Paris is a kind of machine. And that idea of it being kind of fake, so I'm just going to put that in my AO4, artificial, is also built up through lots of different bits of language within here. So for example, it actually has the word artificial, feverish,